The Embroidery Society gathered every second Thursday in the back room of the parish hall, a space that smelled faintly of lavender polish and chalk. The women came with their baskets and spools, gossip folded neatly between fabric swatches, and needles glinting in lamplight. On this particular evening, the chatter never rose beyond polite hums. There was an air of careful restraint, as though each member carried a private irritation they were unwilling to air. Miss Marple, who had been invited by Mrs. Weatherby as a guest, noticed the way glances darted across the table and threads snagged more often than they should. But nothing in her calm observation prepared anyone for what was to follow. At 8:30, the vicar's wife suggested tea, and the group shifted their chairs back. The urn hissed softly in the corner. It was Mrs. Charpentier who went to fetch the cups. When she did not return, Mrs. Weatherby rose with a smile meant to cover a faint unease. They found her moments later, lying across the tiled passage, her workbasket spilled, skeins of silk unravelling into a pool of dark liquid that had spread beneath her shoulder. The teacup she carried had shattered, its shards glittering cruelly under the lamp. Someone gasped, another stifled scream. And in the silence that followed, Miss Marple bent low, her keen eyes narrowing. There was no sign of intrusion. The outer doors were locked, as Mrs. Weatherby quickly pointed out. Every member of the society had been present in the room. Yet here was death, swift and quiet, visited upon a woman of unremarkable habits. Dr. Haydock was summoned, but even before he could arrive, Miss Marple noted the curious detail that would not leave her mind. Beneath the body, half hidden by the threads, lay a single embroidered handkerchief, its corner marked with a small motif of a rosebud. The stitching was delicate, near perfect, except that one petal was distinctly out of alignment, crooked like a mistake, hurriedly corrected. It had not been in Mrs. Charpentier's basket earlier that evening. The members whispered among themselves, their voices pitched with fear. Who would wish harm on her, and why here, in a room watched by so many? The scene seemed impossibly simple. Too simple. Either someone had struck with remarkable cunning, or there was some factor that none of them yet grasped. Miss Marple listened, gathering fragments. Mrs. Charpentier's argument with her daughter last week, her sudden interest in certain accounts at the Women's Guild, the curious fact that she had been seated apart from the others tonight, her work not advancing as it usually did. When Dr. Haydock arrived, he knelt, examined, and pronounced it death by poison. The faint trace of bitterness clung to her lips, unmistakable to one trained in such things. And yet the question of method hung unanswered. The tea had not yet been served, only she had taken a cup ahead of the others. The urn itself proved untainted as tested moments later. The cup was shattered, perhaps deliberately so, perhaps not. If deliberate, then what had been concealed within it? The police followed, their manner brisk and slightly confused, as though confronted with something too ordinary to hold such menace. Inspector Cray examined the lock on the back door, the windows, the cupboard, in which the linens were kept. Nothing disturbed, nothing broken. The members sat stiffly in their chairs, each clutching their work, as though the act of embroidery might shield them from suspicion. Threads stretched taut between fingers, and eyes avoided one another. Miss Marple remained, quiet though her thoughts moved swiftly. She knew the Embroidery Society was not free of rivalry. Women brought their private jealousies with them, hidden beneath patterns and silks, a careless word, a borrowed design, an unacknowledged contribution. These could wound as sharply as a knife. But poison suggested patience, preparation. Someone had planned for Mrs. Charpentier to drink from that very cup in that very moment. and yet the handkerchief puzzled her most of all. It was not new. The fabric bore faint creases, the scent of camphor from long storage. Why leave it here, unless as a signal or a distraction? Inspector Cray announced the obvious. All present would remain until statements were taken. Constables noted names, addresses, and occupations. The vicar's wife dabbed her eyes, though her voice was steady. Mrs. Weatherby muttered that such things had never happened in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple only folded her hands in her lap, her gaze travelling once more to the crooked rosebud on the handkerchief. She recognized the stitch. It belonged to no amateur, but to someone in the room, someone who prided herself on near perfection, yet faltered just once. The crime, so it seemed, was both too simple and impossibly complex. A cup of tea, a fall in the passage, a handkerchief. That ought not to be there. Nothing more. And yet, beneath this quiet surface, Miss Marple sensed currents of malice long in the weaving. The members of the Embroidery Society returned to their chairs, the clatter of teacups and scissors subdued, their eyes betraying the unease of those who wondered which among them harboured a secret worth killing for. Miss Marple said nothing, but already she knew this puzzle, however small in appearance, would prove one of the most curious she had ever observed. For the solution lay not in the obvious question of who had poured poison, but in why a crooked rosebud had been left to bloom beneath the body of Mrs. Charpentier. And with that silent certainty, she waited for the investigation to begin in earnest, the threads of truth tightening invisibly around the room. Inspector Cray lingered by the doorway of the parish hall, his notebook balanced against his palm, his brow furrowed in the way of a man determined not to miss a single procedural step. He questioned the vicar's wife first, her answers neat and untroubled, then turned to Mrs. Weatherby, whose voice trembled more from indignation at the scandal than grief for the deceased. The constables, meanwhile, moved about the room, lifting teacups, peering into cupboards, scribbling down names with the mechanical efficiency of men accustomed to routine. Yet nothing in their movements suggested the least inclination toward imagination. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the hearth with her small knitting bag folded in her lap, watched with her usual air of mild detachment. To the unknowing eye she seemed to be simply present, a frail old lady who had perhaps been caught up in something beyond her depth, but those who knew her better would have recognized the faint tightening at the corners of her eyes, the way her gaze lingered not on the body, now decently covered, but on the expressions that flitted across faces when they thought themselves unwatched. The first curious note was struck when Mrs. Ellison, a plump woman with a fondness for dramatic size, protested too quickly that she had never gone near the tea things. "I always take mine last," she said, wringing her hands. "My digestion simply won't allow it otherwise." No one had accused her, yet her insistence rang oddly in Miss Marple's ear. Inspector Cray, perhaps sensing something amiss but unwilling to pursue it, nodded briskly and moved on. Miss Marple filed it away in that quiet inward ledger she carried everywhere. Then came the matter of the scattered embroidery. The constables gathered the spools, winding the silks back into place, though Miss Marple noticed one spool rolled a little too far from the rest, beneath the radiator. It was pale yellow, a shade she recalled had not been among Mrs. Charpentier's chosen threads. Mrs. Charpentier had worked almost exclusively in deep blues and crimsons, colours bold enough to withstand the dim light of evening. The pale yellow must have belonged to another. Yet here it was, tangled with the blood-dark stain on the tiles. Miss Marple did not point it out. She merely noted the way Mrs. Ellison's eyes flicked toward it, then quickly away, as though she feared it might betray her. Inspector Cray returned presently with Dr. Haydock's preliminary report. "Poison, most certainly," he declared. "A fast-acting compound, very likely slipped into the tea, though precisely how, we cannot yet say. The broken cup complicates matters, of course." He shot a glance at the constable who had swept the shards into a paper sack. "We'll send those for analysis, but I expect little enough to come of it." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Weatherby, who sat stiff as starch, her lips pressed tight. It was not fear she displayed, but rather a fierce determination to see the evening preserved in proper order, scandal contained. When Inspector Cray asked whether any member had enemies, Mrs. Weatherby replied at once, "Certainly not. We are a society of women devoted to art and charity. No one would think to commit such an act here." The firmness in her tone was almost convincing, but not quite. What Miss Marple noticed, and Cray did not, was the faint trembling of Mrs. Weatherby's right hand as she smoothed her skirt. Not the tremor of age, but the kind that betrays a nervous secret. Miss Marple recalled that Mrs. Weatherby had collected the society's dues earlier in the evening. Money had passed hands, envelopes exchanged. A most prosaic detail, yet money often sowed resentment where embroidery alone might not. The inspector continued in his orderly fashion, asking after alibis and routines. Each member explained where she had been seated, what she had been working on, how she had not moved far from her chair, save for a moment or two, to stretch stiff legs. Yet Miss Marple recalled distinctly that Mrs. Ellison had indeed left her place once, crossing behind the table to retrieve more thread. At the time, no one had remarked upon it, but now her earlier protestation about never approaching. The tea-urn took on a sharper edge. The handkerchief still troubled Miss Marple most. The crooked rosebud seemed almost too blatant a clue, as though someone had intended it to be noticed, and indeed, when Inspector Cray held it aloft, he dismissed it with a shrug. "Belongs to the deceased, no doubt, a common enough design." But Miss Marple's eyes caught the flush in young Clara Benson's cheeks at that pronouncement. Clara, the quietest member, always seated near the end of the table, had stitched rose motifs into nearly all her samplers. She prided herself on her precision, yet a crooked stitch like that would have haunted her. Why, then, was it present here, beneath a dead woman's shoulder? Unless, of course, it had been planted by someone who knew her work well enough to imitate it. As the questioning dragged on, Miss Marple rose quietly and drifted toward the window. The night outside was damp, leaves pressed against the glass. She noted that the catch on the window was drawn tight, but faint smears on the sill suggested it had been opened recently. Not wide, perhaps only a few inches, but enough to permit the passing of a small object. A bottle? A packet? The thought whispered through her mind, unbidden yet insistent. Inspector Cray, seeing her there, offered a polite smile. "Best not to trouble yourself, Miss Marple. We'll sort this matter out soon enough." His words were courteous, but carried the dismissive tone of a man certain that a little old lady's observations could add nothing of substance. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression placid. "Of course, Inspector, I am sure you will do everything quite properly." Yet, as she resumed her seat, her gaze flicked once more to the pale yellow spool, the crooked rosebud, the nervous hands of Mrs. Weatherby, and the too hasty protest of Mrs. Ellison. Each detail, small in itself, would have escaped the notice of anyone else. But together they formed a pattern, faint as stitches on the underside of embroidery, visible only to those willing to turn the fabric over and look at what lay beneath. The members of the society shifted uneasily as the evening stretched on. Statements were taken, the hall grew colder, and the body was at last borne away. But Miss Marple, though she remained outwardly serene, knew that deception had already entered the room. Whether in the form of a misplaced thread, a crooked stitch, or a too emphatic denial, the truth was beginning to show through. Only patience was required, and the eye to see what others ignored, and Miss Marple, of all people, had that eye. Inspector Cray began his round of questioning with the brisk assurance of a man certain that a few well-placed inquiries would settle the matter quickly. The women of the Embroidery Society sat in their stiff chairs, work still clutched in nervous hands, as though the familiar act of threading needles might protect them from suspicion. Miss Marple, silent in her corner, watched with her customary calm. What she sought was not so much what was spoken, but how it was said, the hesitations, the small contradictions, the faint betrayals of expression. Mrs. Ellison was the first to speak at length. She dabbed her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief, though her cheeks remained curiously dry. "I hardly knew poor Mrs. Charpentier," she declared, though everyone present was aware that the two had shared a long-standing rivalry over the annual parish fair exhibition. "I never went near the tea-urn, Inspector, never. I can't abide the smell of strong tea. It upsets my stomach." Her insistence was forceful, almost theatrical. Yet only an hour earlier, Miss Marple had watched her sip daintily from her own cup and compliment the vicar's wife on the blend. Inspector Cray, noting her emphatic denial, pressed no further. Miss Marple, however, tucked away the memory like a pin slipped into a cushion. Next came Clara Benson, the youngest member, a pale and quiet girl whose hands shook as she tried to explain herself. "I was near the end of the table all evening," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "I never moved from my place except once. Once, when I dropped a needle. It rolled under the chair, that was all." But Miss Marple remembered distinctly that Clara had risen to fetch more thread from her basket in the far corner. Clara's eyes darted toward the crooked rosebud handkerchief as she spoke, then quickly away. It was not guilt, Miss Marple thought, but rather fear. Fear that her own careful work might somehow be implicated. The vicar's wife followed, her composure outwardly intact. "It was a dreadful accident," she declared firmly. "Dreadful! But such things are beyond our control. I was in the pantry preparing the milk and sugar when it happened. You may ask Mrs. Weatherby. She saw me there." Yet Mrs. Weatherby, when questioned later, hesitated just long enough before confirming that alibi. "Yes, I believe she was in the pantry," she said, though her voice carried the uncertain lilt of one not entirely sure of her recollection. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the distinction, not certainty, but acquiescence. Mrs. Weatherby herself was asked about her duties that evening. She had collected the society's dues, had she not? Her lips tightened. Yes, of course, everything was in order. She glanced at her handbag, which sat near her chair, its clasp firmly shut. The inspector, uninterested in matters of bookkeeping, moved on quickly. But Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Weatherby's hand hovered protectively over the bag, as, though guarding something more fragile than coins and notes. When Mrs. Ellison was again pressed about her movements, she contradicted herself without hesitation. "I never crossed the room at all," she claimed stoutly. Yet not 10 minutes earlier, she had admitted to retrieving more thread. The inspector frowned, sensing the discrepancy, but he seemed unwilling to push further. Miss Marple, by contrast, marked it with interest. People lied in different ways, some to conceal guilt, others to conceal fear, and still others simply because the truth, in all its untidiness, felt dangerous to reveal. The questioning turned to Mrs. Armitage, a tall, severe woman with a taste for precision. Her embroidery was the finest in the society, her stitches neat, enough to be mistaken for machine work. "I noticed nothing unusual," she said, crisply. Except perhaps Mrs. Charpentier seemed distracted. She pricked her finger twice, which is unlike her, but otherwise nothing. Yet Miss Marple recalled that it had been Clara, not Mrs. Charpentier, who cried out softly when her needle slipped. Either Mrs. Armitage was inattentive, which seemed unlikely, or she was deliberately misplacing her observation. Inspector Cray continued doggedly, but it became increasingly clear that the more he asked, the less consistent the answers became. Everyone had been in the same room. Everyone insisted they had scarcely moved, and yet threads of contradiction wove through their statements. Mrs. Ellison had both crossed the room and not crossed it. Clara had both remained seated and risen to fetch more thread. The vicar's wife had both been witnessed in the pantry, and perhaps not at all. Through it all, Miss Marple observed with an almost grandmotherly patience. She knew from long habit that the smallest deceptions often revealed the most. People rarely lied about the great matters. They lied about the little ones, the movements no one was expected to remember, the words spoken in passing. And in those little lies lay the pattern. At one point, as Mrs. Weatherby repeated her indignation that the society could be associated with such a scandal, Miss Marple let her eyes drift once more to the pale yellow spool that had rolled under, the radiator. No one had claimed it, though each woman glanced toward it with the quick, furtive look of one aware but unwilling to speak. Finally, Miss Marple asked in her gentle voice, "Whose thread is that, I wonder? Such a delicate shade. One might almost mistake it for a daffodil." The room grew still. Clara looked down at her lap. Mrs. Ellison's lips parted, then closed again. Mrs. Armitage cleared her throat. No one answered. Inspector Cray, missing the weight of the silence, dismissed it with a wave. "A trivial matter, we can sort it later," but Miss Marple knew it was no trivial matter. A spool of thread in the wrong place, a crooked stitch on a handkerchief, a contradiction in the pantry. These were not random, they were voices of deception, speaking in different tones, but all part of the same chorus. The question was which voice sang true and which concealed the hand that had poured the poison. When the inspector at last concluded his round of questions, he left with the conviction that the case was one of opportunity alone. "Someone slipped something into the cup, that much is clear," he said. "We shall narrow it down." Yet, as the hall emptied and the women gathered their baskets with hurried, nervous fingers, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze thoughtful. She had seen the tremor in Mrs. Weatherby's hand, the false tears of Mrs. Ellison, the nervous silence of Clara, and the misplaced observation of Mrs. Armitage. 4 small deceptions, each pointing in a different direction. The truth was there, hidden among the stitches, waiting for the patient eye to trace it. And Miss Marple, more than any inspector, had the patience for such work. The following morning the Embroidery Society convened again, though not in their usual cheerful fashion. The vicar's hall had an air of tension about it, as if the very walls had absorbed the unease of the previous night. Inspector Cray arrived with his constables, ready to press on with the matter in his orderly way. Yet it was Miss Marple who, from her seat by the fire, began to see the deeper tangle that lay beneath the surface. Motives, like threads, were seldom neat. They frayed, overlapped, and sometimes disguised themselves in bright colours that concealed darker strands. The first clear motive appeared in Mrs. Weatherby. She had long been the guardian of the Society's funds, a duty she held with solemn pride. Yet when Miss Marple, in her gentle, unthreatening manner, asked about the envelopes collected the night before, Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. Inspector Cray dismissed the matter as trivial bookkeeping, but Miss Marple was not so sure. Money often provided sharper temptation than passion or revenge. Rumour in the village had it that Mrs. Weatherby's son had recently faced financial difficulties. Could the funds in her handbag have been a source of dispute? Could Mrs. Charpentier perhaps have discovered irregularities? The notion sat in Miss Marple's mind like an untied knot. Then there was Mrs. Ellison, whose rivalry with the deceased had been common knowledge. Every parish fair saw the two women submit their best pieces, and every year accusations of copied patterns and borrowed designs had floated about in whispers. Mrs. Charpentier had won last year's prize with a bold sampler that Mrs. Ellison claimed was nothing more than her idea stitched in a louder thread. Jealousy was a motive as old as time, and Mrs. Ellison's quick protestations about the tea-urn only made her appear more entangled. Yet jealousy alone rarely produced poison. It was a hot emotion, more suited to cutting remarks and social snubs than careful preparation. Unless, of course, that jealousy had stewed long enough to curdle into something colder. Clara Benson's name, too, rose among the whispered suspicions. The crooked rosebud on the handkerchief had drawn eyes toward her, though Miss Marple doubted it belonged to her at all. Clara was conscientious to the point of timidity. She lived quietly with her widowed mother and rarely raised her voice above a murmur. But her talent with needle and thread had begun to overshadow the older members of the society. Mrs. Charpentier, in particular, had once dismissed Clara's work as too neat to have any soul. That remark had reduced the girl to tears. Could such humiliation have brewed into resentment? Clara's nervousness might suggest guilt, or it might merely reflect the cruel burden of being young and easily suspected. Mrs. Armitage presented another path through the maze. Tall, disciplined, her eyes sharp as her stitches, she had always prided herself on her authority within the society. She had been close to Mrs. Charpentier once, collaborating on designs and presenting work side by side. But something had soured between them. The two now barely exchanged words beyond polite necessity. Mrs. Armitage's insistence on a detail that proved untrue, that it was Mrs. Charpentier who pricked her finger, not Clara, raised the question of whether she was protecting someone else or deliberately muddying the waters. What benefit did she gain from steering suspicion away from where it might naturally fall? The vicar's wife, too, was not free from the web. Her alibi, supported faintly by Mrs. Weatherby, rested on being in the pantry. But Miss Marple could not shake the impression that Mrs. Weatherby's confirmation had been reluctant. The vicar's wife was a woman keenly aware of appearances. A scandal within the parish hall threatened not just reputations, but the comfort of her own household. She had cause to contain matters, perhaps even to redirect them. Fear of disgrace could make people say things they did not truly see. Each thread suggested a motive, yet none quite explained everything. If money had been the reason, why involve a handkerchief with a rosebud? If jealousy, why so careful a method as poison when harsh words would have sufficed? If fear of exposure, why leave any clue at all? The maze twisted back on itself, each turn revealing another knot. Inspector Cray, exasperated, declared, "The simplest answer must be true. One of these ladies slipped the poison into the cup, and that is that. We need only determine which had the chance." He tapped his notebook with finality, as though the puzzle were already half solved. Miss Marple, in her mild voice, offered no contradiction, but her thoughts wandered deeper. Chance alone was never enough. People acted from reasons, from grudges, or desires that clung to them like threads to a sleeve. She considered the pale yellow spool once more. No one claimed it. Yet its placement beneath the radiator, away from the scattered basket, suggested deliberate positioning, and Mrs. Ellison's glance toward it, coupled with her false words about the tea, hinted that she feared its significance. But why? The motive maze was tightening. Mrs. Weatherby might have feared exposure of misused funds. Mrs. Ellison might have been driven by envy, sharpened by years of rivalry. Clara might have resented humiliation or been set up to take the blame. Mrs. Armitage might have wished to protect or accuse another by misplacing her observation. And the vicar's wife might have lied out of fear, not malice. Each woman had a reason, yet each reason lacked one piece to make it whole. As the society members filed reluctantly from the hall, Inspector Cray instructed them not to leave the village until further notice. Miss Marple lingered, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked at the empty space where Mrs. Charpentier had sat, the broken thread of her work still lying across the table. Death had entered quietly, like a stain spreading through cloth. But the pattern of human motive, however tangled, could be teased apart by patient fingers. She murmured softly, as though to herself, "It is always the small things that matter, the stitch out of place, the spool out of reach, and the words spoken too quickly or too slowly. Yes, I think the pattern will show itself soon enough." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that suggested she was already following a path through the maze, even if no one else yet saw the way. The next evening, word spread quickly through the village that the police had found what they believed to be their breakthrough. Inspector Cray entered the vicar's hall with the air of a man carrying triumph in his breast pocket. He laid a small packet upon the table, wrapped in brown paper, and announced with satisfaction that it had been discovered in the dustbin behind Mrs. Ellison's house. Inside was a small glass vial, still carrying the faint, bitter scent of the poison Dr. Haydock had identified. For the inspector, the case had neatly closed upon itself. Mrs. Ellison was brought in, pale and fluttering, protesting with great waves of her hands. "I've never seen such a thing in all my life. It must have been planted there," she cried. But her voice lacked conviction, and her protests rang hollow. The rivalry between her and Mrs. Charpentier was too well known, her jealousy too often remarked upon at parish gatherings. The villagers, eager for resolution, nodded to one another and muttered that it made sense. Inspector Cray, buoyed by their assent, declared that charges would be prepared. Miss Marple sat in her usual quiet corner, her face serene, though her knitting needles stilled in her lap. To the inspector's eyes she looked the picture of elderly compliance. But her mind stirred restlessly. Something did not fit. Mrs. Ellison was envious, yes, but she was also careless. Poison required patience, discretion, the ability to think 3 steps ahead. Mrs. Ellison, with her dramatic size and her untidy stitches, did not possess that kind of subtlety. And the vial itself troubled Miss Marple. It was too convenient, lying so plainly in a bin where it would surely be found. A careful poisoner would have disposed of it in the fire or ground it to dust, not tossed it within reach of any constable's eye. When Mrs. Ellison was pressed for an explanation, she fell into contradictions. "I never touched a cup all evening," she insisted, though only the night before she had admitted to crossing the room. "I hardly spoke to Mrs. Charpentier," she declared, though everyone had seen her lean across the table to correct a stitch. These were lies, yes, but lies of panic, not cunning. Miss Marple recognized the tone. Mrs. Ellison lied to shield herself from shame, not to conceal murder. Inspector Cray ignored such subtleties. He preferred the clarity of a solution presented to him. "The motive is plain enough," he said. "Years of rivalry, a festering jealousy, and the opportunity of the tea urn. She slipped the poison into the cup when no one was watching. The vial proves it. Case closed." His voice brooked no argument, and the constables nodded obediently. Miss Marple noticed the way Clara Benson's face drained of colour at the mention of the vial. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, flickered not toward Mrs. Ellison, but toward Mrs. Armitage. And Mrs. Armitage, in turn, sat with arms folded, her mouth set in a thin, rigid line. A small current of tension passed between the two, as silent as a thread pulled through cloth. Miss Marple saw it, though no one else did. Later, when the hall emptied and Inspector Cray congratulated himself, Miss Marple lingered. She bent to pick up a dropped spool near the hearth. Pale yellow again, that same shade that had appeared beside the body. She turned it slowly in her hand, then set it back where she had found it. If Mrs. Ellison had been the true culprit, why had no one yet admitted ownership of the thread? Why did it continue to appear, displaced, like a breadcrumb trail leading away from the obvious? The inspector, oblivious, announced his intent to present his findings to the magistrate. The village, relieved to have a culprit named, began to breathe again. But in Miss Marple's mind, unease spread. Too much fit too neatly, like a pattern embroidered too quickly, without the tiny irregularities that betray a human hand. "Real life was never that tidy." She recalled Mrs. Weatherby's trembling hand upon her handbag, the vicar's wife's uncertain confirmation, Clara's nervous glance at the handkerchief, and Mrs. Armitage's misplaced observation. All these threads remained dangling, unknotted by the inspector's triumph. Mrs. Ellison might be guilty of vanity, envy, and foolish deception, but murder? Miss Marple doubted it. That night, as she sat in her cottage, the fire casting faint shadows on the wallpaper, Miss Marple reviewed the case in her thoughts. The poison, the handkerchief with the crooked rosebud, the thread out of place, the contradictions in every voice. She knew the true criminal was still hidden among them, watching, waiting for the relief of suspicion to pass elsewhere. A false victory had been claimed, but the true victory, the kind that ended in justice, still lay ahead. In the silence of her sitting room, she murmured, "No, it won't do, it's much too simple, and the simplest things, when too neat, are never true." She smiled faintly, for she had learned long ago that patience and attention were sharper than any policeman's badge. The shadow still lingered, and she meant to follow it until it revealed itself at last. The parish hall lay quiet the following afternoon, the society's long table still scattered with odds and ends left behind in the confusion of the previous nights. Miss Marple had asked Mrs. Weatherby, with her customary politeness, whether she might look over the room once more. The older woman hesitated, then relented, though her eyes betrayed reluctance. Alone among the fragments of cloth and thread, Miss Marple moved slowly, her fingers brushing the back of a chair here, the edge of a spool there. She was not searching for what was obvious. The police had already gathered every shard of porcelain, every teacup, every vial. What she sought were the quiet remnants of the past, the things overlooked because they seemed too small, too irrelevant. It was by the hearth that she found it. Not the yellow spool she had noticed before, but a fragment of embroidery tucked beneath the leg of a chair, as though pressed there by accident. The fabric was worn, the design unfinished. A border of roses faded by time, the thread brittle at the edges. It was not new work, not the sort that anyone in the society would have proudly displayed at their weekly gatherings. It had the look of something older, cast aside, yet carried in someone's basket that night. Miss Marple, turning it over in her hands, remembered a case nearly 15 years past, a quarrel over an embroidery prize that had ended in public disgrace. The name Charpentier had been linked even then, whispered in the village with pity and censure. As she recalled it, Mrs. Charpentier's late husband had been caught up in scandal involving misappropriated parish funds, a matter quietly settled, but never wholly forgotten. At the time, certain members of the Embroidery Society had stood in harsh judgment, none more vocal than Mrs. Weatherby. The memory returned to Miss Marple now with the sharp clarity of an old photograph. Mrs. Weatherby, her lips thin with disapproval, declaring that such disgrace had no place in a respectable family. That Mrs. Charpentier had continued to attend the society after that was remarkable, a quiet act of defiance. But bitterness, Miss Marple knew, seldom disappeared. It lingered, quiet and poisonous, like dye soaking deep into fabric. She carried the fragment to her cottage and set it beside her teacup, considering. The crooked rosebud on the handkerchief, so carefully planted, might not have been meant to implicate Clara at all. It could have been a reminder, a symbol harking back to that old quarrel. The rose design once used in competition, the prize bitterly contested. What if the motive lay not in last year's jealousies or this year's dues, but in a resentment buried for decades? That evening, she paid a visit to Clara Benson's mother, a frail woman with cloudy eyes and a sharp memory for village tales. Over tea, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the past. Mrs. Benson spoke of her youth, of how she and her daughter had always been on the edge of the society's circles, tolerated but never fully embraced. "It was Mrs. Charpentier, you see," she said softly. "Her husband's disgrace made her bitter, and she had a tongue that could wound. Clara never forgot the way she was spoken to." Miss Marple listened, noting each word, each pause. Clara had been little more than a child when that scandal broke. Old slights cast long shadows, especially on the sensitive. On her way back through the darkening lanes, Miss Marple turned over the other threads in her mind. Mrs. Ellison's rivalry seemed petty in comparison to such deep-rooted bitterness. Mrs. Armitage's misdirection, her false claim about the pricked finger, might have been an attempt to shield Clara, who was more fragile than the rest. And Mrs. Weatherby's trembling hand over her handbag, could it be guilt not of money, but of memory? She had been one of those most vocal in condemning the Charpentiers long ago. If Mrs. Charpentier had threatened to revive that story, perhaps to shame her, there might indeed have been reason to silence her. The next day, Inspector Cray came to see Miss Marple, though with a weary smile that suggested he had not yet given up on his neat conclusion. "We've sent the vial for testing," he said. "It contained precisely what killed her. The magistrate will hear the case against Mrs. Ellison by week's end." Miss Marple offered him tea and nodded as though listening kindly to a child's story. "That will be very tidy, Inspector," she said. "And yet I wonder, do you not find it curious that the vial should be so easy to find? Or that every woman in the room had some quarrel with the deceased, not merely Mrs. Ellison?" Cray brushed this aside, but unease flickered faintly in his eyes. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to the fragment of embroidery by her hearth. She smoothed it flat, her fingers tracing the faded roses. It belonged not to Clara nor to Mrs. Ellison, but to Mrs. Charpentier herself. It was her old work, once scorned, once mocked, carried still in her basket, perhaps as a reminder of grievances past. And someone had seen it, someone who remembered the quarrel, and had chosen to use its design, the crooked rosebud, as a signature upon her death. Not an accident, then, but a deliberate message meant either to mislead or to point backward into the shadowed history of the society. The pattern grew clearer. This crime was not merely about envy over fares or disputes over dues. It was about reputations tarnished long ago, about grudges carried in silence across decades, about the poisonous residue of humiliation. Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and gentle manner, understood how old wounds festered in small communities. The present, she knew, was only ever the surface stitching. The real fabric of crime was the past. That night, as she laid aside her knitting and closed her eyes, Miss Marple murmured softly into the quiet, "Yes, there is more here than anyone cares to admit." This embroidery was begun long ago, and someone has only now completed the pattern. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth seldom yielded itself to direct assault. People hid behind words, behind careful stories and rehearsed answers. But they betrayed themselves when caught unawares, when nudged into revealing more than they intended. In her quiet cottage, she considered how best to draw such betrayals from the ladies of the Embroidery Society. A straightforward question would not do. Inspector Cray had already exhausted them with his formal inquiries. No, what was required was something subtler. A test disguised as harmless conversation, a little needle slipped beneath the cloth to see which thread tugged loose. The following afternoon, she invited the principal members of the society to her cottage for tea. Mrs. Ellison arrived first, visibly shaken by the suspicion that hung over her, fluttering her shawl as though it were a flag of innocence. Clara followed, her pale face downcast, her mother guiding her gently inside. Mrs. Armitage came with the stiff dignity of one prepared to defend herself against insult, and Mrs. Weatherby with that same tremor in her hand that had not lessened since the night of the murder. The vicar's wife, too, joined them with her polite composure and eyes that darted too quickly from face to face. The table was set simply, with scones and little sandwiches, but it was the teacups that held Miss Marple's design. She had laid out a mismatched set, each cup with a different painted flower upon its rim, a daffodil, a violet, a carnation, a rose. It was the rose cup she placed nearest to her chair, though she did not touch it. As the women settled, Miss Marple began to speak lightly of embroidery competitions of years gone by, of past fairs and the prizes won and lost. She remarked, in her mild way, how curious it was that certain designs returned again and again, like signatures of a hand. "Take the rose, for instance," she said, her voice soft, almost dreamy. "So many of us have stitched it, and yet each stitcher has her own way, a little flourish, a little crookedness that makes it hers alone. One could almost tell the woman by the rose she embroidered, don't you think?" She let her eyes drift casually across the table as she poured the tea. Mrs. Ellison blustered at once. "I've never much cared for roses in my work. Too common, too sentimental." Her voice was loud, insistent, and Miss Marple noted that she reached eagerly for the cup with the carnation. Clara flushed, her hand trembling as she took the violet. Mrs. Armitage, after a moment's hesitation, accepted the daffodil. Only Mrs. Weatherby reached without thought for the rose. It was a simple thing, an unconscious choice, but Miss Marple saw the faint tightening in her expression as she lifted the cup, as though realizing a moment too late what she had done. Mrs. Weatherby's hand quivered as she set the cup back on its saucer, a tremor she tried to disguise by smoothing her napkin. "I suppose roses are rather overused," she murmured. Yet her voice lacked conviction, and her eyes avoided Miss Marple's. The conversation wound on, drifting to memories of old fairs and past rivalries, but Miss Marple continued to prod, gently, asking whether anyone remembered the scandal years ago when a certain design had caused a quarrel. Mrs. Ellison seized the opportunity to dramatize, declaring that she remembered every detail, though her account contradicted itself. Twice in the telling, Clara said nothing, her eyes fixed on her lap. Mrs. Armitage, stiff as ever, declared the whole matter unworthy of mention, but Mrs. Weatherby paled. "Best not to dwell on such unpleasantness," she said quickly, almost sharply. Later, when the guests had departed, Miss Marple sat back with her hands folded, reviewing the afternoon's little play. The unconventional clue had not been a scientific test, nor a piece of elaborate trickery. It had been a simple matter of flowers on cups, a suggestion of roses and signatures, an invitation to memory. And Mrs. Weatherby had betrayed herself. By reaching instinctively for the rose, the symbol tied so deeply to the crime, it was not proof. Inspector Cray would have dismissed it as nonsense, the kind of whimsy one might expect from an old lady with too much imagination. But Miss Marple knew better. People revealed themselves in their smallest choices, in the little things they did, when unguarded. The rose cup, the tremor, the sharpness in her voice when the past was raised, these were the cracks in the pattern of deception. That evening, as she wrote a letter by lamplight, Miss Marple paused and smiled faintly to herself. "Yes," she murmured, "the threads are loosening. It only takes a little tug, and the whole design begins to unravel." The following morning dawned with a thin drizzle that soaked the cobbled streets of St. Mary Mead and left the hedges glistening. Miss Marple walked to the vicar's hall with her usual unhurried step, umbrella neatly angled, her thoughts circling back to the rose cup, the trembling hand, and the faint shadows of the past that clung to Mrs. Weatherby. She had begun to feel that the pattern of the crime was finally showing itself, thread by thread. But when she arrived, she found Inspector Cray already in the hall, his voice sharp with frustration. "The vial has gone," he declared to the constables clustered near the table. "Taken from the station overnight, locked away, and yet vanished. Come morning, somebody knew its value." The announcement rippled through the village within the hour. The only tangible piece of evidence, the one item Inspector Cray had trumpeted as proof against Mrs. Ellison, was gone. Without it, the magistrate would balk. The villagers, who had begun to feel safe in the neatness of a solved crime, now muttered anxiously in shop doorways and over fences. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood quietly in the corner of the hall, her hands folded. She had expected something of this kind. The vial, she had always believed, was too convenient to be true, but its disappearance proved more. Someone was watching, closely, interfering actively, desperate to bury the truth before it came fully to light. The constables fumbled through the parish hall cupboards, as if the vial might miraculously reappear in a sugar tin or beneath the hymn books. Inspector Cray muttered about carelessness and possible conspiracies, his confidence fraying. "It can only be one of them," he said grimly. "Someone still free is working to erase the trail." Miss Marple's mind turned not to the vanished vial, but to the smaller clues, those not so easily carried off. The crooked rosebud, the pale yellow spool, the unconscious choice of the rose cup. These could not be stolen in the night. They lived in memory, in gesture, in the very character of the suspect, yet the removal of the vial changed the ground beneath her. It raised the stakes. Someone was frightened enough to take risks, to move in the dark, to tamper with police property. That sort of boldness revealed desperation. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Clara Benson under the pretext of bringing a jar of jam. She found the girl pale and distracted, her embroidery untouched in her lap. When Miss Marple mentioned the missing vial, Clara's hands trembled violently. "It isn't fair," she whispered. "They'll never believe anything now. It will all be forgotten." Her words struck Miss Marple as curious. Forgotten. Why should that be her greatest fear, unless some memory weighed on her, something she longed to see resolved? Back in the High Street, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Ellison, flustered and loud, proclaiming her innocence to anyone who would listen. "They'll say I took it, of course. They'll say I crept into the station like a common thief," she declared to the butcher, who nodded with weary politeness. Miss Marple studied her. Mrs. Ellison enjoyed her own drama too much to stage it in the dark, unseen. If she had tampered with evidence, she would have found a way to ensure everyone knew of it by morning. Mrs. Armitage remained silent, however. When Miss Marple stopped by her neat house, she found the woman stiff, her answers clipped. "The loss of evidence is unfortunate," she said, "but it changes nothing. The truth is what it is." Yet her eyes betrayed something else, not certainty, but relief. Miss Marple recognized the look of someone who felt a dangerous weight shift from their shoulders. The most telling reaction came from Mrs. Weatherby. When Miss Marple mentioned the theft casually over a cup of tea at the vicarage, the woman's hand shook so badly she spilled half her saucer. "Gone?" she repeated, her voice thin. "How dreadful! How inconvenient!" The words were wrong. Not tragic, not shocking, but inconvenient, as though the loss troubled her in a practical sense, not a moral one. Miss Marple marked it carefully, though she smiled and passed the sugar without comment. By evening, Inspector Cray was pacing the hall in frustration. "We had our case, and now it is ruined," he said, rapping his notebook against his palm. "Without the vial, we have nothing to stand on." Miss Marple looked at him with quiet kindness. "Not nothing, Inspector. Only the sort of things that cannot be written in a report, but those, I assure you, are often the strongest threads of all." As she walked home beneath the dripping trees, Miss Marple considered what had been gained and what had been lost. The vial had never been true proof, but its disappearance revealed the hand of the guilty more surely than its presence ever had. Someone within the circle of the society had risked everything to alter the course of justice, and if they had dared that, they might yet dare more. The crime, Miss Marple thought, was no longer simply about envy or old rivalries. It had become a matter of survival. The criminal had begun to fight not just to remain hidden, but to actively erase the path that led to them. Trust in such a climate became as fragile as lace. Even a friend's word could be twisted, even a neighbour's memory altered. But Miss Marple, with her steady eye for the human pattern, knew that no amount of tampering could hide the truth forever. In the darkness of her cottage, she set down her knitting and murmured softly, "The more they try to cover it, the clearer it becomes. Every stitch unpicked leaves a mark, and this fabric will not hold much longer." The drizzle had thickened into a steady rain by the time word reached Miss Marple that something dreadful had happened again. The bell at the vicarage clanged with an urgency seldom heard outside of fires or funerals. Villagers gathered in cloaks and shawls, their faces pale with gossip before fact had even formed. Miss Marple, umbrella firm in hand, made her way through the wet lanes, her step brisker than usual. She feared she already knew what awaited. The hall where the society had met was once more at the heart of it. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and ink, mingled now with the sharper tang of spilled ink from a toppled ledger. Clara Benson sat against the wall, her mother weeping beside her. But Clara herself was silent, her face chalk-white, her eyes staring as though fixed on something invisible. At the far end of the room, Inspector Cray bent over another figure. Mrs. Armitage, so sharp and composed only the day before, now lay slumped in her chair, her embroidery fallen to the floor. Her lips were tinged blue, her eyes staring wide, and the small china cup at her side still steamed faintly. Poison again? The inspector cursed softly, his neat solution collapsing under the weight of reality. "This proves it," he muttered. "We were right about Mrs. Ellison all along. She struck again to cover her tracks." He turned toward the constables with an authority born less of certainty than desperation. Miss Marple, however, felt the prickle of unease sharpen into something colder. No, it would not do. The first death had been too neatly explained by the discovery of the vial. The second, arriving now when suspicion had almost settled, was not a continuation, but a disruption. It meant the true hand was not content merely to have misdirected justice. It meant they were watching, calculating, and willing to strike again in order to preserve their mask. She moved quietly among the chairs, noting details others missed. The ledger toppled, its ink bleeding across the page. Mrs. Armitage's cup, filled not from the urn, but from a smaller pot at her elbow. And near the hearth, again, a spool of pale yellow thread, as though the very colour itself followed death through the room. Miss Marple bent, picked it up delicately, and slipped it into her pocket. Clara's silence troubled her most. The girl's lips trembled, but no words came. When Miss Marple knelt beside her, Clara whispered, barely audible, "She knew." Mrs. Armitage knew. Then her mother hushed her quickly, casting a fearful glance toward Inspector Cray. The inspector, too busy marshalling his men, did not hear. But Miss Marple did, and the words lodged in her mind like a thorn. The village shuddered under the weight of the second crime. 2 deaths in so short a time, both in the same circle, both by the same unseen hand. Doors were bolted early, curtains drawn. Mrs. Ellison protested loudly that she had been nowhere near the hall, that she had witnesses to her whereabouts. Yet her cries of innocence only convinced the inspector further of her guilt. He prepared at once to send for her arrest, unwilling to see the pattern beyond the surface. But Miss Marple saw the pattern. This was not the work of a woman blundering in jealousy, nor of a girl trembling under humiliation. It was the work of someone who had lived long enough with bitterness to weave it into patience, who understood that one stitch alone could not hold. The fabric must be reinforced. The first death had been the silencing of Mrs. Charpentier. The second was the elimination of Mrs. Armitage, who, Miss Marple now suspected, had come too close to seeing the truth. She thought again of the rose cup at her tea table, of the trembling hand that had reached for it, of the word inconvenient spoken when the vial disappeared. Mrs. Weatherby had long been the pillar of the society, the guardian of its funds, the moral judge of its conduct. Yet pillars sometimes cracked, and their collapse was all the more dangerous because no one dared to look for weakness there. Miss Marple said nothing that evening. She returned to her cottage in silence, the rain pattering against the windows, her fire burning low. She thought of Clara's whispered words. She knew. If Mrs. Armitage had indeed seen through the deception, then her death was not random. It was an act of fear. The villain was not merely ahead of the inspector, the villain was willing to keep stepping ahead as often as necessary until no voice remained to accuse them. For Miss Marple, the problem was no longer only to uncover the truth, it was to prevent the next death. And she knew with a clarity that chilled her that if the pattern continued, another thread would be cut before the week was out. She whispered into the stillness of her room. The game is being played at a quicker pace now, but haste leaves marks, and marks can be followed. The rain had ceased by the following morning, leaving the village washed pale beneath a thin autumn sun. The air carried that particular stillness that follows calamity, as though the very hedgerows were listening. Miss Marple, seated in her cottage with her knitting untouched upon her lap, allowed her mind to turn and return over every detail. 2 deaths now, Mrs. Charpentier first, then Mrs. Armitage, both poisoned, both bound together by threads too fine for Inspector Cray to grasp. Yet somewhere among those fragments of embroidery and words, the pattern had already revealed itself. She need only fix her gaze upon it. She thought again of the vanished vial, the too convenient evidence planted against Mrs. Ellison. She recalled Clara's fearful whisper that Mrs. Armitage knew. What had she known? Perhaps only what Miss Marple herself had begun to suspect. That the murder was not born of sudden envy, but of something older, heavier, woven into the fabric of the society itself. Her memory lit upon a moment so small, it might easily have been overlooked. Mrs. Weatherby, when told of the missing vial, had described it as inconvenient. Not tragic, not dreadful, but inconvenient. Miss Marple had smiled politely at the time, yet the word had echoed ever since. It was the language of someone who thought in terms of order and propriety, of accounts balanced and disturbances tidied away. Mrs. Weatherby had always presided over the society's funds, had kept its rules in order. For her, a scandal was not sorrowful, it was messy, and mess had always been her enemy. Then came another recollection, so fleeting she had nearly dismissed it. On the night of the first death, as the body lay upon the passage tiles, a pale yellow spool had rolled near the radiator. No one had claimed it. Later, another spool of the same shade had appeared near the hearth when Mrs. Armitage fell. Usatigs, police had not noticed, and the others had looked away. Yet thread did not wander of its own accord. To appear twice, at 2 deaths, in the same unusual colour, it was no accident. And Miss Marple remembered, with the clarity of long habit, that only one member of the society had ever worked consistently in that pale yellow, Mrs. Weatherby. Her samplers, displayed proudly at every fair, bore borders of daffodils stitched in that exact shade. The crooked rosebud, too, returned to her mind. It had been placed not to implicate Clara, but as a deliberate misdirection to conjure the memory of old quarrels. Only someone who remembered those quarrels, who had lived through them with bitterness still sharp, would have thought to employ such a symbol. Clara was too young, Mrs. Ellison too careless, Mrs. Armitage too proud. But Mrs. Weatherby, she had been there, had spoken harshly of the Charpentier family's disgrace, had guarded her own position with the tenacity of one who could not afford to be exposed. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her hands folded, and allowed the threads to cross. Mrs. Charpentier had perhaps discovered something, a mismanaged account, a whisper of impropriety, and threatened to speak. That would explain the trembling hand upon the handbag, the quick glance whenever funds were mentioned. And Mrs. Armitage, sharp-eyed, had sensed it. Perhaps she had begun to piece together the significance of the pale yellow spool, or had caught a slip of the tongue. And so she too had been silenced. It was all there in plain sight. The yellow threads, the word inconvenient, the instinctive reach for the rose cup, the tremor that never stilled. Miss Marple smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with the quiet recognition of truth long suspected. She had seen the pattern from the start. Only now did it emerge fully formed. That evening, she attended the brief gathering Inspector Cray insisted upon, though his confidence had been battered by the second crime. The remaining members of the society sat tense, their eyes darting like frightened birds. Mrs. Ellison clutched her shawl, Clara sat pale and silent, the vicar's wife murmured polite platitudes, and Mrs. Weatherby, though outwardly composed, looked older than she had a week before, her hands folded tightly on her lap, as though to keep them from betraying her. Miss Marple, with her mild smile, allowed the conversation to drift until, at last, she said, "It is curious, is it not, how certain habits betray us? One might think a spool of thread a trifling thing. Yet it has followed us faithfully, night after night, to the very places where death has struck." Her words fell into silence. Mrs. Ellison frowned, Clara's eyes widened, the vicar's wife shifted uneasily. Mrs. Weatherby alone did not move. Only the faintest stiffening of her shoulders betrayed that she had heard. Miss Marple went on, her tone no more than conversational. "And words, too, have a way of showing us more than we intend. A dreadful thing may be called tragic or sorrowful, but only one who prizes order above all else would call it inconvenient." Inspector Cray glanced at her, puzzled, but Miss Marple offered no further explanation. The time had not yet come. She had the pattern, but the net must be drawn carefully, with patience. To rush would be to risk another life. As the meeting ended, and the women drifted away into the damp night, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her eyes following Mrs. Weatherby's retreating figure. The culprit had walked among them all along, her habits betraying her more surely than any confession. The challenge now was not in knowing, but in proving, and in preventing her from striking again. In the quiet of her cottage that night, Miss Marple whispered, "The rose has bloomed crookedly, but the stitch will." The following day the parish was subdued, the usual gossip quieted into whispers, as though the village itself feared to speak too loudly. 2 deaths hung heavy in the air, and suspicion clung like damp to every conversation. Miss Marple, however, had already traced the design to its centre. The threads of deceit, the pale yellow spools, the crooked rosebud, all pointed to Mrs. Weatherby. Yet what remained elusive, what made the picture incomplete, was the why. Not money alone, not envy alone, but something deeper, something that had sat in the heart for years until it curdled into poison. She resolved to pay a visit. Mrs. Weatherby's house stood a little apart from the main lane, its hedges clipped so sharply they looked as if no bird would dare rest upon them. Inside, the sitting-room was as ordered as the garden, doilies perfectly squared upon the arms of chairs, a mantel clock ticking with metronomic precision, not a cushion out of place. Mrs. Weatherby herself sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. "I thought," Miss Marple said gently, "that you might like some company. These last days have been such a strain." The other woman smiled thinly. "A strain, yes, but one bears it. One must." They spoke of ordinary matters at first, the state of the church roof, the likelihood of frost. Miss Marple, with her mild persistence, steered gradually toward the past, She spoke of the society's long history, of quarrels at the parish fair, of the scandal that had once touched the Charpentier name. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes hardened at that. Some disgraces, she said sharply, ought never to be forgiven. Once trust is lost, it is lost forever. It was a curious thing to say, Miss Marple thought, given that Mrs. Charpentier had continued to sit week by week at the same table. And yet, she murmured, Mrs. Charpentier endured it. She bore the whispers. Perhaps she had strength in that way. Mrs. Weatherby's lips thinned. She had no shame, if you ask me, to sit among us as though nothing had happened, to look down her nose at the rest of us after her husband had ruined good people's savings. No, she should have gone. It was an insult. She stayed. And there it was, the root beginning to show itself. Not money alone, but humiliation, the affront of having her own moral authority overshadowed, challenged by a woman she despised. Miss Marple let silence linger, her needles clicking softly, as though she were merely passing the time. "But Mrs. Armitage?" she asked at length, softly. "Why her?" For the first time Mrs. Weatherby faltered. A flicker crossed her face, a tightening at the corners of her mouth. "She was cleverer than the rest," she said, almost in a whisper. "Too clever, she saw, she guessed." Miss Marple lifted her eyes, kind and steady. "Guessed what?" Mrs. Weatherby looked away, her voice low, bitter. "That it was not only disgrace I could not forgive. It was envy, too. For all her faults, Mrs. Charpentier had a kind of charm. People forgave her where they would never have forgiven me. She could sneer, and they laughed. I held the purse strings, I did the work, and still they whispered behind my back. Always. I was the stern one, the one who must keep order, while others broke it. Do you know what it is to be invisible, Miss Marple? To give everything and still be nothing but the keeper of rules? I would not have it any longer." The words spilled with a bitterness that years had distilled. Miss Marple saw it now, not simply a question of stolen funds or old scandals, but of pride of a woman who had built her life on propriety and control, who could not bear to be diminished by those she judged unworthy. The poison was not only in the cup, it had been in Mrs. Weatherby's heart, feeding on resentment until it demanded release. "And so you silenced her," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not because she had wronged you anew, but because she reminded you of every slight, every humiliation, every time you felt your place was unacknowledged." Mrs. Weatherby's hands clenched upon her lap. "I had to. She would have ruined what little respect I had left." She had begun to ask questions about the funds. I saw it in her eyes, and if she spoke, if the others listened, then everything I had built, all my order, all my position, would have been swept away. Better she go quietly, better no one ever know. Her voice broke on the last word, though her face remained cold. It was not greed alone that had driven her, nor rivalry, but the desperate hunger of a woman who had lived her whole life craving control, terrified of being seen as weak. Mrs. Armitage, clever and sharp, had noticed the trembling hand, the misplaced spool, had begun to connect the threads. For that she too had been silenced. Miss Marple sat in silence for a long moment, her needles stilled in her lap. At last she said, "You know, my dear, embroidery is very much like life. One may stitch as carefully as one pleases, but there are always knots beneath the surface, always a crooked thread, showing what one wished hidden. And sooner or later someone will turn the cloth over." Mrs. Weatherby flinched as though struck. For a moment she seemed to shrink, her dignity sagging like cloth left too long in the damp. Then she straightened, her mask slipping back into place. "You have no proof," she said quietly. "No one will believe the word of an old lady against mine." But Miss Marple only smiled faintly, her eyes kind yet unyielding. "Proof will come. It always does once the pattern is clear." As she walked home through the fading light, Miss Marple reflected on what she had uncovered. The motive was not money or rivalry alone, but the far more corrosive poison of wounded pride and festering resentment carried across years until it demanded blood. That was why Mrs. Weatherby had been willing to go to such extremes, because in her mind she had not murdered for gain, but for dignity. To her, the crime was not a crime at all, but a bitter act of preservation. Miss Marple's step was slow, her face grave. It was one thing to discover who had killed. It was another to glimpse so clearly the dark chambers of a soul consumed by its own need for order and respect hold. Yes, the pattern is quite cold-y. Parish seemed almost to exhale once Mrs. Weatherby's name had been quietly passed among the villagers. Inspector Cray, relieved to have something solid at last, prepared his papers with the air of a man drawing a curtain on an unpleasant play. "We've the motive, we've the means, and with your testimony, Miss Marple, the magistrate will have no choice but to bind her over," he declared. The constables nodded, villagers muttered their satisfaction, and for the first time in days, shutters opened a little earlier, and shopkeepers smiled with cautious relief. But Miss Marple, walking slowly home beneath the chestnut trees, was not smiling. Something still itched at the edges of her mind, something untidy, like a loose thread in a sampler, otherwise finished. She had thought it was pride alone that had driven Mrs. Weatherby, sharpened by the memory of old scandals and fresh humiliation. And yet the second murder, Mrs. Armitage, still troubled her. If Weatherby had struck once out of long-festered resentment, the second killing carried a different note, not pride, but panic. But what if that panic had not been hers? That evening she sat by the fire, replaying every voice, every protest, every tremor she had observed. And then, like a candle lit in a darkened room, a memory flared. Clara's whisper in the aftermath of Armitage's death. She knew. At the time, Miss Marple had assumed it referred to Weatherby. But what if Clara's words had been incomplete? What if Mrs. Armitage had known something else entirely, something Clara herself carried? The next morning, Miss Marple asked Clara to her cottage under the pretence of needing help with a difficult stitch. The girl arrived pale, obedient, her hands folding into her lap with habitual nervousness. As Miss Marple guided her to the fire, she spoke gently of old scandals, of Mrs. Charpentier's pride, of Mrs. Weatherby's bitterness. Clara nodded faintly, offering no contradiction. Then Miss Marple laid down her knitting and asked softly, "My dear, why did you never claim the yellow thread?" Clara froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes, wide and stricken, filled with a fear far deeper than innocence unjustly suspected. And Miss Marple knew in that silence that the spool had not merely been misplaced, it had been Clara's. The truth unfolded with dreadful clarity. Clara had been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one whose talent had grown too bright for the older members of the society to ignore. She had endured Mrs. Charpentier's cruelty, her mockery of soulless stitches. But deeper still lay another wound. Clara's father, long dead, had once been among those who lost money in the Charpentier scandal. Her mother had spoken of it often in bitterness. To Clara, Mrs. Charpentier was not merely a rival, but the embodiment of every slight, every humiliation that had shadowed her family. Mrs. Weatherby had been guilty of envy and bitterness, yes, but Clara had seized upon it. She had planted the crooked rosebud to recall old quarrels, had slipped her pale yellow thread near the bodies as both signature and misdirection. Mrs. Weatherby's pride had made her an easy target, her tremor and harsh words masking Clara's own hand. And Mrs. Armitage? She had seen it. The sharp-eyed woman had noticed that the yellow spools were Clara's, had perhaps remembered seeing them in her basket before. And for that, Clara had silenced her too. When Miss Marple spoke these conclusions aloud, Clara crumbled. Her voice broke into sobs. "I never meant the second, not at first." But she guessed. She looked at me as though she knew. I couldn't let her tell. "I've always been nothing, Miss Marple. Nothing but stitches and whispers. For once, I wanted them to see me." It was tragic in its simplicity. Not greed, not power, but the desperate, distorted cry of a young woman starved of respect, twisted by her mother's bitterness, emboldened by the secrecy of her needle. Clara had hidden her darkness behind silence, behind trembling hands that everyone mistook for fragility. And in the end, it had been that silence which allowed her to move unseen. Miss Marple, though her heart softened with pity, did not waver. "My dear," she said gently, "we all long to be seen. But true recognition cannot be taken by poison. It must be earned in patience, in kindness, otherwise it is no recognition at all, only fear." By the time Inspector Cray arrived, summoned discreetly by Miss Marple's message, Clara had collapsed into her chair, her tears spent. The inspector, astonished, sputtered his disbelief until the pale yellow spools were placed before him, until Clara's whispered confession sealed what no one had suspected. Mrs. Weatherby, though guilty of pride and spite, had not been the true hand. She had been a decoy, a shadow behind which the real villain hid. The case, which had seemed so near resolution, twisted suddenly into a darker truth. The murderer had been the least suspected of all, the quiet girl in the corner. As Clara was led away, Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, watching the rain return in fine misting sheets. There was no triumph in her expression, only the sorrow of one who has seen too often how the smallest hurts, left untended, can grow into tragedies. She whispered, almost to herself, "It is always the quiet ones, the ones no one looks at. And it is always the little things, a thread, a word, a cup, that reveal the truth at last. Here now." The rain cleared just in time for the magistrate's hearing, leaving the cobbled streets slick and shining, the air cool with the smell of wet stone. Villagers crowded near the hall, whispering in tight knots, their eyes flicking nervously to the constables who stood guard at the door. The shock of Clara Benson's confession had unsettled them more than Mrs. Weatherby's disgrace ever could have. A girl so pale, so timid, so apparently harmless. How could she have harbored such darkness? The question hung heavy in the mist, unanswered. Inside, Clara sat hunched, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her mother wept beside her, rocking slightly, as though the motion might undo what had been done. Inspector Cray shifted impatiently, his pride stung by the revelation that had eluded him. He glanced now and then toward Miss Marple, as if still struggling to accept that the frail old woman had uncovered what he, with his notebooks and constables, had missed. Miss Marple herself sat quietly, her hat neatly pinned, her expression soft but steady, as though she had seen all this before. And perhaps she had, in some form or another. When the magistrate called for the account of events, it was Miss Marple who rose, her voice calm and low, carrying through the hushed room. She began not with accusation, but with observation. The matter seemed, at first, simple. A vial discovered in Mrs. Ellison's dustbin. Too simple. I thought then that we were being invited to believe something convenient. Real life, you see, is never so tidy. She recounted the crooked rosebud handkerchief, the misplaced spool of pale yellow thread, the word inconvenient spoken by Mrs. Weatherby. It seemed to me that someone wished us to look backward, toward old scandals, old rivalries, when the true thread was being stitched quietly in the present. She turned toward Clara, whose head hung low. "My dear, your work has always borne that yellow shade, delicate, precise, and beautiful. But it was your undoing, because beauty cannot disguise itself. Twice that colour appeared where death had struck. Twice no one claimed it. Yet I remembered your samplers at the fair. Only you stitched with that yellow." A murmur passed through the hall. Clara trembled, but she did not speak. Miss Marple went on, her tone gentle, almost maternal. And Mrs. Armitage, clever, observant, she saw it too. She must have noticed the spool or recalled its origin. She guessed, as you feared. That was why she had to be silenced. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. "But the motive, Miss Marple, we were told it was Mrs. Weatherby's pride, her resentment. What drove this girl to such lengths?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "The true motive was older, quieter, and sadder than we thought. Clara's family had suffered from the Charpentier scandal many years ago. Her father lost money, her mother never forgot, and the bitterness was passed down, drop by drop, until the girl herself carried it. Add to this the sharp tongue of Mrs. Charpentier, her cruelty toward Clara's work, her mocking words. Such things wound deeply in a young heart. And so the resentment grew until it was no longer bearable. This was not greed, nor even envy. It was humiliation ripened into hatred. That is why the handkerchief bore a crooked rose, a symbol of old wounds stitched anew. The magistrate listened gravely, his pen still. Clara began to sob, quietly at first, then with a force that shook her thin frame. Her mother clutched her, but the girl whispered again and again, "I didn't want to. I only wanted her to. Stop." Miss Marple lowered her gaze, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. She had no triumph in her expression, only the weary knowledge that truth, when revealed, brought no joy to those bound in it. Justice, however, did its work. The magistrate declared Clara to be held for trial in the county court, her fate, too, be decided by law. The constables led her gently away, her sobs echoing faintly down the corridor. The villagers filed out in silence, their faces pale, their gossip subdued. None of them would ever look upon the quiet girl at the end of the embroidery table without remembering the bitter pattern she had woven. Later, in the vicar's garden, Inspector Cray approached Miss Marple with an awkward half-bow. "I suppose, I must admit it," he said. "You saw what I could not. A spool of thread, a crooked stitch. I would never have thought such trifles mattered." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded. "It is always the trifles, Inspector. Murderers are very good at concealing the grand design, but they cannot help leaving their habits behind them as plainly as dropped stitches. One only needs the patience to notice." He nodded, chastened, and left her there among the rose bushes, where the last of the rain still clung to the petals. Miss Marple looked at them for a long while, thinking of the crooked rosebud, the yellow thread, and the girl whose desire to be seen had led her into darkness. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law. But in Miss Marple's quiet mind, the case left a shadow. For Clara had been, in her way, as much a victim as Mrs. Charpentier or Mrs. Armitage, a victim of old resentments handed down, of cruelties spoken in passing, of pride that blinded neighbours to the silent suffering in their midst. As she turned to walk home through the damp lane, Miss Marple whispered softly to herself, "The law will punish, yes, but what of the wounds that made her? Those, I fear, will remain, and will bloom again unless we learn to notice the little things." The village returned slowly to its routines in the weeks that followed. Curtains opened at their usual hours. The postman made his rounds with his whistle, and children once more played in the square without glancing nervously toward the parish hall. Outwardly, St. Mary Mead was itself again, but beneath the quiet surface something had shifted. The Embroidery Society, once so prim and ordinary, carried a scar no needle could mend. 2 women dead, a girl taken in disgrace, and the name of the village whispered in tones of scandal as far away as the county. Miss Marple went about her days as she always had, trimming her roses, visiting the vicarage, knitting by her fire. Neighbours stopped her often, expressing admiration, even awe. "Without you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Ellison declared, "we'd have gone on believing the wrong person guilty." Miss Marple only smiled politely, for she never took pleasure in such things. She knew too well that behind every solved case lay not triumph, but sorrow. And yet, even as the villagers settled, she found her mind lingering on 1 or 2 details that refused to lie quiet. The yellow thread had been Clara's, yes, and her confession had borne the weight of truth. But when Miss Marple laid out her work in the quiet of her parlour, she noticed that the second spool, the one she had picked up by the hearth after Mrs. Armitage's death, bore a faint trace of dust at its edge, as though it had been placed deliberately, not dropped. Clara, in her panic, might have left it behind, but the thought troubled Miss Marple. It was too neatly visible, too conveniently found. Had Clara really intended to leave her mark so boldly twice over? Or had another hand sought to underline her guilt, making certain suspicion never strayed elsewhere? And then there was Mrs. Weatherby. Though no longer under suspicion, she had withdrawn from the society, her house shutters drawn earlier each night. Pride wounded, reputation stained, she lived in silence. Miss Marple recalled too clearly the tremor of her hand, the bitterness in her voice, the unguarded word, inconvenient. Clara had confessed, but was Mrs. Weatherby's conscience entirely clean? Had she, perhaps, nudged events, guided the girl, whispered in her ear about unforgiven wrongs? Poison could be poured into the mind as easily as into a cup. One afternoon, as Miss Marple tended her roses, a note arrived, slipped beneath her door without signature. It bore only a single embroidered scrap. A rose, stitched crookedly, the thread uneven, unlike Clara's meticulous hand. Beneath it, in cramped lettering, were the words, "Some wounds are never mended." Miss Marple held the fabric in her palm, her eyes narrowing. It might be the bitter gesture of a villager, a cruel prank meant to prolong scandal. Or it might be something more, a reminder that while one crime had been answered, another story lingered in shadow. She tucked the scrap into her knitting bag, saying nothing to Inspector Cray. For she knew the village was not ready for more suspicion. Yet in her heart she acknowledged what she always had, that mysteries seldom ended as neatly as the law believed. There were always threads left loose, knots hidden on the underside of the cloth. One might resolve a case, but human nature, with all its jealousies and wounds, would always stitch new patterns. On Sunday, she walked to church as usual, her step steady, her hat tied firm beneath her chin. The The villagers greeted her with gratitude, some even with reverence. She nodded, smiled, offered her soft, "Good morning." But as she slipped into her pew, her mind was not on the hymn. It lingered instead on the crooked rose, the faint suggestion that someone else still carried resentment sharp enough to sew into cloth and push beneath her door. After the service, she stood at the lich gate, watching the congregation disperse. The vicar's wife fussed with her gloves, Mrs. Ellison laughed too loudly, and Mrs. Weatherby passed by with her head held high, her eyes carefully avoiding Miss Marple's. The old detective tilted her head slightly, as though acknowledging an unspoken challenge. As the bells faded and the lane grew empty, Miss Marple turned toward her cottage. The roses in her garden swayed in the breeze, their petals bright, their stems marked with thorns. She paused, looking at them thoughtfully, then whispered under her breath, "Yes, a mystery never ends. One is solved, but another waits just beyond the hedge." She smiled faintly, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet readiness of one who knew that human hearts, like her roses, would always bloom again, beautiful, fragile, and edged with thorns,